Hey, it's Ryan, back to ramble on about some Moon Knight. Again, assuming you can hear me, I've got a water heater, and no kidding, I think 2 parties on either side of me. I love my neighborhood, and I mean that literally, but I think I have, one of them's like a few houses down, but the other one's just 2 houses down, and the one 2 houses down will usually bring over some barbecue. So really, I do love my neighborhood, but I hope isn't too much of a distraction for what I'm going to do here, which is talk about episode 2 of the Moon Knight TV show. I've been reading, or I did read, I guess I've fallen off a little bit, but read like 40 years worth of Moon Knight books, really love the character, and did it in preparation to watch the TV show. Finally got around to watching the TV show, talked about it last episode, and now we're here for episode 2, called Summon the Suit is the name of the episode. And just by way of introduction, there's a little blurb about the episode on IMDb that might get us started. It says, with little time to react, Stephen is thrust into a war of the gods as a mysterious partner arrives. And I think that mysterious partner is referring to his wife, or Mark's wife. Again, we're kind of in the middle of deciding how his multiple personality is going to manifest, and honestly how it came about. Now that we're digging into a little bit more of Mark Spector, that side, since the show began with Stephen Grant, it does seem like Moon Knight's origin in the TV show might be more similar to the book than I was expecting after last week's episode, because Mark Spector does, so Stephen Grant often interacts with Mark Spector by way of a mirror. So they're kind of talking to each other, and sometimes he'll let Mark Spector take control, and then it'll be Stephen Grant in the mirror. So, which I really dig, by the way, but I'll talk more about that later. So in talking to Mark Spector, he does make allusion to the fact that he was a mercenary. In fact, I think in the first episode, when the bad dude, when Ethan Hawke sees Stephen Grant, he calls him out as Mark Spector, calls him out as a mercenary. So this idea, which has always been the traditional origin of Moon Knight, that he was a mercenary out in the Middle East, and it does differ at this point whether or not he refused some orders or whatever it was, but is dying in the desert, comes upon a crypt of sorts wherein the god of the moon, or a statue of the god of the moon, is in there, and essentially it resurrects him. Or does he? That's a question kind of depending on what you're reading at the time. So they make allusion to that a little bit, so it sounds like the origin might actually be what's happened, but doesn't answer any of the questions as to how the personality split came about, why we started with Stephen Grant, why Stephen Grant has no idea. I mean, obviously we're at a crossroads with the character where he's discovering his alter in Mark Spector. But the phone call he made in the first episode, the person on the other end of that line shows up, and it turns out it's his quote-unquote wife, or Mark Spector's wife, it seems, which, new for the character, Moon Knight himself, I don't believe was ever married, not even to Marlene, who was like his long time from the very beginning. She would come back and forth. I think they eventually did have a kid in one of the later books I was reading. It was not a great book, so I didn't get invested much in that story. But the only other love interest I think he ever had was Tigra, while he was in the West Coast Avengers, which there was another one-off, I want to say, where she shows up again. So somebody remembered that besides me. But that's it. Like, he's never married in the comics necessarily. So cool, fun twist. I also like that Stephen Grant, who's kind of lovelorn as the everyman, or maybe a little less than the everyman. So he like quickly develops a crush on this girl, which is kind of funny. So I'm into that. But I'm going to skip around a little bit just because I think there are a bunch of different pieces from this episode that come together in some really cool ways. And one of those is the character of Khonshu. So Khonshu is that moon god from the crypt that resurrected Mark Spector. And over the years, a lot of different writers do a lot of different things with him. He's in the background, he's in the foreground, he's real, he's a question mark. But eventually, I think the show is taking from more recent iterations for sure in this respect. Eventually, he does become a true character, just not one that we know exists out of Mark Spector's head, or not? And also, is it good for Mark Spector or not? And in all these repeated dealings with Mark Spector in this episode, they do a really good job of towing that line, and also in his meetings with the bad dude, with Ethan Hawke. But the way that Mark Spector talks about him is more like they've made kind of an uneasy pact, right? I think he says he has a debt to repay, which, again, if I'm assuming they're going all the way with the origin, it's that Khonshu did resurrect him in some way, so Mark Spector feels like he does have a debt to repay. But it's an uneasy alliance of sorts. And the more he deals with, Arthur Harrow, or Harrow is the name of Ethan Hawke's character, who it turns out was an old or previous avatar of Khonshu, which is also new and I love. Like, I don't think I've ever read a Moon Knight story where that's been the case. There are cases where like other Egyptian gods have called avatars and they become nemeses of sorts for Moon Knight, but I don't recall there ever being a previous or even future or other. There kind of is one, but it was like a wannabe, like he wanted to be and turned out never was, so it wasn't like a real thing. But avatar of Khonshu, like it's only ever been Moon Knight. But in this story, Arthur Harrow apparently is an ex-avatar, so he like knows all of these things that Khonshu is telling Stephen or Mark in his head, and it's stuff like you don't have to listen to him, or he's I don't know if he actually calls him petulant, but he that has been an aspect of his persona. And certainly since, if I didn't mention this last time, by the way, actually, because I couldn't remember who came up with the bird skull form of Khonshu, it was the Vengeance of the Moon Knight book from 2009. So it was either Greg Hurwitz, the writer, and or Jerome Opeña, the penciler, that came up with that. But also this idea that you don't have to listen to Khonshu, that he's not as imposing as he is. And that's definitely a signature of that book. He's terribly imposing. You don't have to listen to him. Like all the explosions that you're seeing also aren't really happening. And they definitely toy with that in this show, in this episode. And I love to see it. Like it was one, like when Khonshu became ambiguous in his purpose, sometimes in his presence, especially, were when Moon Knight was really at its best, I think, the books. Not that I didn't like stuff like the West Coast Avengers run, which I feel like I mention every time, because I did like it so much, but it just wasn't one for subtlety in that way, especially when it came to Khonshu, who they pretty much eliminated all middle ground with. Like, he's real. He's an absolute character. In fact, at one point, he just takes over Moon Knight's body, or Mark's body, or whoever's body, and it just is Moon Knight. Like, Moon Knight is Khonshu for at least a few issues until he also just physically leaves Mark Spector. So not a lot left to the imagination necessarily, even though I did like it a lot. Khonshu is a much more complicated character from, at the very least, Vengeance of Moon Knight onward, but also in this show, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. And by way of some of the things that the ex-Avatar, Ethan Hawke's Arthur Harrow, does say. So, Arthur Harrow, why hadn't I heard of him before? Obviously had to look it up. He's basically one big walking Easter egg, essentially. He shows up, which this is why I didn't remember him, in one issue of Moon Knight version 2. So after Moon Knight's first solo book hit it big and went for, 30 something issues, so you're looking at 3-4 years, they tried to reboot it with not as cool of a costume, not great stories. I don't know, that was part of what I hated about reading all those books sometimes, is I never knew why some of them ended. I could guess. And in this case, I guessed that version 2 of Moon Knight, which I think was subtitled or pre-titled Fist of Khonshu, I would guess that was canceled because it wasn't super great. So that they would take a bad guy from one issue of that book, and not that he, like, I probably should have remembered him because he's this doctor that continues the Nazi experimentations on actual human beings. So pretty dark, especially for a Jewish superhero. And I totally forgot about. Like he leaves by the end of the issue, and all we know is that he takes up again, probably in Paraguay somewhere, but never shows up again, like in the Marvel Universe. Period. Like never ever comes back. So if you think that's a strange pull for the TV show, it's actually not. Like it's kind of a smart move, one that they, now that I've mentioned it, you'll probably see elsewhere as well. Because there's no, like, he doesn't bring any baggage with him. It's a fun little Easter egg, so dorks on a podcast can talk about it for 20 minutes. And and then they don't have to worry about any fallout necessarily. I guess, again, after 2 episodes, I don't know, maybe they really go all the way. Given what I know about about Arthur Harrow so far, just from these first 2 episodes, it doesn't seem like his bit is recreating the Nazi experiments. It seems like his bit is basically pre-crime, actually. Which I think it's a pretty decent pathos for the bad guy, because it's got this, veneer of positivity in some way. Whenever he murders a person with his magic wand, he's like, I wish you could see the world we're going to create. So and I'm sure it's going to get deeper if this show has taught me anything so far. But so far, it's that he's offing people that will at one point make a mistake or somewhat dirty up the gene pool. I don't know, maybe we are going full on Nazi with this one. But by the end, we're already seeing the cracks, right? Even Stephen Grant figures it out that, wait, you're trying to tell me, because there's a good chunk of the episode that's taken up with Arthur Harrow and Stephen Grant talking to one another, and I think him trying to convince kind of Stephen to come over to his side and being a willing participant of sorts, even though the bit about him being an ex-Avatar is still more questions than answers right there. But I like it. Like I did, in fact, all of there's a little tiny bit of backpedaling at the very beginning of the episode where, because again, one of the other big question marks was if he does really have a multiple personality thing going on. Like, is he actually seeing the monsters? At the beginning of this episode, he's reviewing the footage from the previous episode where a monster, like he defeated a monster as Mark Spector / Moon Knight and basically destroyed the place, which it sounds like the destroyed thing actually happened given how he speaks with the security guard. But then in reviewing the footage, they don't see any of the monster. They just see Stephen Grant running away, and they just see Mark Spector coming out of the destroyed restroom. So a little bit of backpedaling that I think is totally fine because I'm into the pacing of this so far. Even, this is going to sound bad, even for a TV show, which especially miniseries can have this issues, especially Disney miniseries for that matter, Marvel miniseries for that matter, where like they've got an idea for a movie and, oh, okay, then now we just have to add a bunch of stuff to turn it into 6 episodes of a TV show. Like, it happens. Probably the most egregious example that I'm going to get in trouble for is The Expanse, which I think is better than what I just described. But part of the reason I couldn't stick with that show is because for as good as the first season is, it's like the first act. So it's like 30 minutes, the first 30 minutes of a movie for 6 episodes. And I bet it gets better, and I bet overall it's fantastic. Like, I've only heard good things, but that kind of stalled me out on it. And this show is not doing that, I don't think. Like, there's 1% of a hint of it at times, and obviously I'm probably just into the character so much. Like, I hope I'm not hand waving too much here, but I do dig what they've done for the most part. When it comes to that, I'm still not sure. The reason I'm hesitating right now is because the thing that they land on, because by the end of the episode, you got to end with a big, some action. And I don't know if you do. That's why I said it like that, but they do. So Arthur Harrow calls up another monster, and Stephen Grant runs. I'll tell you what I loved about this bit. So Stephen Grant is running from the monster, and his wife is telling him to summon the suit, which also I don't believe was ever a thing in the comics. It might have been like halfway through the 90s book. I mean, Mark Spector Moon Knight was the one, when comics were booming in the 90s, that was the Spector Moon Knight solo book that rose with the tide. And it's good. It's got some great stuff and some really bad stuff about it, but eventually it just succumbs to complete 90s nonsense. And perhaps at that point, the suit is a real thing that he summons and kind of becomes part of his body, or however that goes. I don't think so, though. At one point, he has like a disease that I think incorporates the suit in some way, but I'm not like that. I don't even think that's necessarily what they're going for. So whatever, I'm not actually complaining about that. In fact, I love it because as he's falling off of a building, trying to summon the suit as Stephen Grant, because he refuses to give control to Mark Spector, because he's also at odds with what it sounds like Mark Spector has had to do in his life as a mercenary. He basically summons the suit halfway, as Stephen Grant, this little less than an everyman, like I mentioned. And it's the Mr. Knight suit, which is the actual 3-piece suit, all in white with a mask with the moon on the forehead type thing. I love it. But in the comics, and I keep searching and researching this because I feel like I must be wrong, there's no justification for it. It's just an issue of Secret Avengers where all of a sudden he shows up. Like maybe they're like, Mark Spector's weird. He's got a multiple personality thing going on. So sometimes he does weird things. And now he's showed up in this 3-piece suit for some reason. Like that's maybe what they were going for, but they don't talk about it other than I think one of the girls on the team mentioning it for like a second. But in the TV show, it's because it's Stephen Grant trying to do this thing that he doesn't know how to do. And since he's heard the word suit, he's summoned this suit, and it's the Mr. Knight. So I kind of really like that justification that they came up for the Mr. Knight suit in that moment, in that it's more of a manifestation of Stephen Grant as Moon Knight rather than Mark Spector as Moon Knight. But the thing I'm unsure about is that, and I don't know, like this is pure total armchair at this point, because I don't know what you would have done otherwise, but they come up with the monsters are real, which we maybe should have assumed. But again, in the beginning of the episode, we don't see the wrecked bathroom. So there's a chance that wasn't there either. But the solution they come up with is that they are real. They're just invisible. So the wife is witnessing the whole fight that Stephen Grant as Moon Knight is having with this monster, as cars are getting dented and stuff like that. In fact, I think she throws something at it and it lands on it, so she can kind of see the outline of it. So I get it. There's probably not many other solutions you could have done other than maybe let us go a few more episodes without knowing exactly what's up. But it's probably all part of, like I said, actually having to end the episode on an action sequence. So it's fine. And it looks so good. In fact, this was actually directed by Benson and Moorhead this time around, which I'm not such a guy that I can be like, and it's different for this reason, because I don't like, just because I don't know them as well, but also, I don't know how much Marvel was letting them. In fact, what are we still 2022? So yeah, they might have been, Marvel had a period where they were letting the auteurs go to town. It seemed like probably the last hurrah of that was Sam Raimi's Doctor Strange, and I feel like the high point was probably Taika's Thor Ragnarok. But I think by 2022 they might have been pulling back on that just a little tiny bit. So even though if you put this next to any other Marvel property and I'm like, oh, this looks like Benson and Moorhead do Marvel, I don't know if they're necessarily calling all of the shots, and if I would notice if they were. So either way, it looks really good. I'll leave it at that. I like how we were ending this episode on Khonshu is this possibly manipulative and, yes, petulant entity of sorts. I like how we're ending, I think, on Mark Spector in control. So Stephen Grant's in the mirror at this point. And yeah, because by the end, we get to see a little bit of that. So Moon Knight has a dark thread, let's say. Even in the kind of reimaginings or rebootings where they tone that back, he's always a pretty violent character. And this is probably Bill Sienkiewicz somewhere along the line, the way he drew him in that first solo book for so long. I feel like it would have been hard to get away from that necessarily, both as a writer, but Doug Mensch, who was the kind of creator and the writer for all of early Moon Knight for a very long time, wrote all of Marvel's horror books too. So Moon Knight's first appearance was as the nemesis to Jack Russell, the Wolfman. So I like at the end of this episode how Mark Spector kind of flips out and shatters that mirror, like kicks it and just keeps kicking it and goes a little bit overboard. Like, I don't know if we're really going to get into that for this show, but that feels incredibly true to what I know about Moon Knight. So still really into the show, still looking forward. In fact, I've had to put the brakes on. My family's still very much enjoying it. I need to record one of these before I watch another episode, or I can't imagine how mixed up I would be even just listening to this. So I've had to put the brakes on just like binging that thing. So these will keep coming out every week at the very least. And everything else also on the channel, I tried to mention it last week, but we're on a brand new schedule for the new year. So you're going to see me continue to be live every Tuesday at 10 a.m. with a Tetris, like live streamed. And then pre-recorded, I've got episodes of the Chasers Season 2 dropping, where Evelyn and I open up a pack of Marvel cards from 1994. And then on Friday, I'm producing one of these every week. So it's a little bit more current, I guess you could say, especially since I sometimes don't know what movie I'm going to do from one week to the next. Cinematic, and I'll give you a real heads up on Cinematic. In fact, it was going to be In the Line of Duty 4, and I guess may still be depending on procurement. But I'm going back because I realize that I have really left two big directors off of my Hong Kong action list, and it's John Woo and Ringo Lam. So look forward to a movie from one of those giants this coming Friday. So either way, thanks for listening. Thanks for hanging out. Always. We'll see you next time.